Jumpin In on Manx Radio.
With Howard and Chris Kane.
Hello.
Good evening.
And welcome. And here we are again on a Friday evening at Manx Radio. It's the best in modern and contemporary jazz, and another one of our little specials for you this evening with myself, H.
And me, Chris. Yes, welcome along to this week's show, and we do have something a bit different for you. Whilst, of course, we regularly chat about jazz, we've never actually discussed whether our favourite albums are stuck in time or if they stand up to date. So what we've done is choose all the music for this show from 1 year. Of course, the catch is you have to work out the year, which we'll reveal later or the next show. Who knows? So, H, without giving anything away, did you have to dig deep to find tonight's offerings, or do they happily still come to hand as they're in your regularly listening pile?
Oh, you know, I listen to a lot of retro stuff. There's a huge amount of new stuff coming through, and I've only got one pair of ears, and there's only so many hours in the day, as they say, and I've no doubt got more music than I'll probably live for in years to listen to. Nonetheless, yes, you do go back, don't you? Just like your fathers before you, to some of your favourite tracks, or a lot of your favourite tracks and music, which just means something to you. And I've dug out quite a few which do exactly that. A bit of Matheny, a bit of Jarrett, a bit of Eberhard. There's so much.
Simple yes would have done. And from me, well, we're cloudy, dizzy, meeting a stereotating bovine, and we dive straight in with some alluringly alliterative funk and a sound piece of advice for a Friday night. Hang up your hang-ups. may just be me, but if that doesn't get your groove going, you may be listening to the wrong show. Sounding just as good as it did when it was released, Herbie Hancock. It was his 15th studio album, and when we used to think of him as one of the hip young guys, he is in fact 85 now and still on the road and playing, plus a cast of thousands, well, 20 anyway. Also, not all playing on every track, but including fellow headhunters Benny Maupin on various reeds, Paul Jackson on bass, and Mike Clark and Bill Summers on drums and percussion, respectively. Joining Benny on saxes, we had Wayne Shorter playing on that track, Jim Horn and Ernie Watts, as well as Stevie Wonder pitching in on harmonica on some tracks, along with a full brass section, and that track featured extensively Melvin Wah Wah Watson on guitar. Definitely a keeper.
Good old Wah Wah, yeah. Is it of its time, and has it lasted well? Sounds great, doesn't it? It does sound great. I think this next one sounds great. You could ask the same question. It does have a feeling of its time, equally as a feeling of no time at all, I think, in many ways, and still something I go to on a regular basis. If you'll excuse the pun, bassist there. Eberhard Weber on bass, Charlie Mariano, Rainer Buringhaus and Jan Christensen from, I think, the first album they actually put together on ECM called Yellow Fields. And this is Touch. Still sounding, pushes all the buttons for me, still sounds, as I often say on this programme, fresh as paint. Sort of an era, but definitely doesn't sound dated or like it's past it. It still really speaks to me, that one, same as it did when I first heard it. And curiously, not the first Aberhart album I heard. It was Silent Feet, which you've been playing, and I picked up off of that and thought, wow, this is brilliant. And it was several years, I think, before I actually heard this one. Aberhart Weber. Still with us, sadly hasn't played for quite some time after suffering a stroke quite a few years back, but I think he still sort of composes or mixes things together and listens, I hope, to a lot of music. On bass, and his lovely upright bass and special effects. Charlie Mariano, no longer with us, of course, for a long time on his soprano sax, and on Nagasvaram, as he is on the next one, Sandglass, which is quite a long track. Rainer Bruninghaus still playing, of course, with Jan Garbarek and touring quite a lot with them with keyboards, and the, again, sadly gone far too early, Jan Christensen, magician of the drums, who had such an incredible touch on the drum kit for this sort of music. Really, still really touches me, that one, if you'll excuse the pun, and that was indeed touch.
Next up for me, an album which is a close relation in some ways, which I have to get into at least one show every year. Variously reported by reviewers as an absolutely stunning oral tapestry of sound. I like this one. Seriously wild avant-garde jazz. Someone else, perhaps my all-time favourite album by any artist, or as Pat Metheny said on hearing this in a blindfold test, I've never heard anybody play anything even remotely similar, let alone improvising with such freedom on a 12-string guitar. Have you guessed it yet? Here's Nimbus. Nimbus from Ralph Towner's Solstice album, which I first heard, curiously enough, on John Peel's Eclectic Late Night Show, along with Eberhard Weber's Colours Group just played before, and Terry Ribdall's Odyssey, and John Abercrombie's Gateway. This was before he got into his new wave phase. He was very mixed in the early day, with quite a lot of jazz in the show, and other musics. It was he who, let's not forget, got Laurel and Hardy into the pop charts with the Trail of the Lonesome Pine.
Yeah, that's right.
But all of those albums remain difficult to pigeonhole, or indeed date, I think, recorded in typical ECM clarity. Solstice was described by All About Jazz as a classic. It is the introduction to a group with a sound utterly unlike anything that anyone has heard before. And what a group. Jan on sax and flute, Eberhard again on upright bass and cello, Jon Christensen dancing on the drums and cymbals with feather-like precision, and of course Ralph Towner composing all the music on 12-string guitar, classical guitar and piano. And if you enjoy that as much as I do, then you probably should dig up the other release by the same lineup, Solstice, Sound and Shadows, which makes a fine companion.
It is Jumpin' In with Chris and myself, H, and one of our little specials this week. So I'm not just looking at some of the latest releases. Lord knows there's a lot of them, and most of them come our way one way or another. We'll have to do a bit of catching up at some stage. There's so much good stuff. I'm well behind, it has to be said, but some great new stuff coming out, some great new releases on ECM coming out. A John Taylor one, would you believe, out from the vaults, which I've got but not heard yet, but there was one recently also came out of an old John Taylor, which was an actual cracker, Marscapes or something like that, and some new stuff from Charles Lloyd out on Blue Note as well. But we are celebrating a year. I'm not going to say what it is at the moment, but a year which sort of might mean something to us. It's going back in the day a wee bit, and all the music on this evening's programme comes from that one specific year. Another artist I've listened to for a long time, certainly since from this year, or thereabouts in any case, if not earlier, is John Sermon. And he's played in all sorts of different setups, I guess, from solo, very well known for his solo outings, whether just straight on solo sax or, again, using ostinati by using synths and doing up synth patterns and such like, which is the way I first came across him, and still really love his work doing that. But also back in the day when he was a young Turk, of course, he was pretty much at the cutting edge of some fairly free, exciting stuff, which was, well, quite a hard listen for some at the time and wasn't necessarily appreciated in the UK. And this band, SOS, John Sermon, Alan Skidmore and Mike Osborne, was one of those. They were right at the cutting edge, appreciated very much on the continent, didn't really cut it in England because I don't really think people quite got the music in the same way. Brilliant players all, didn't last very long, only 1 or 2 albums ever came out, I think, and this one was re-released from some not outtakes, but some recordings, I think, fairly recently on Cuneiform form. And this is Sermon's Country Dance.
Yeah.
SOS. Now that is namely John Sermon on saxes, on baritone sax, of course, most famously Sermon, and the composer of that piece, Mike Osborne, alto sax, and he does some percussion on some tracks as well. And then Alan Skidmore, soprano and tenor saxophone. And again, I think they all played drums at some stage, one way or another. Not easy music to find, maybe not easy music to listen to. Certainly wasn't, like I said, appreciated in Britain at the time, but did do rather well on the continent. But realistically, they didn't have a huge recorded legacy, and what there is isn't that easy to come by. It's probably online somewhere along the lines. But I still enjoy it, I must admit, and it still sort of has that raw energy about it. Whether you call it beautiful, personal preference, I guess.
Hey, they did perform at Bracknell one year, I remember. And in fact, also, we saw John Sermon at Bracknell playing with his synthesizer.
I think we saw John Sermon with Stan Tracy at Bracknell one year, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, but we saw him with Karen Krogh as well.
And Karen Krogh, indeed.
I bid on his Mini Moog when it came up on eBay. In fact, other auction sites are available. Next for me now, total change, and what was a surprising release from rock guitarist Jeff Beck. At the time, he'd recorded with the Yardbirds, the Jeff Beck Group, and Beck, Bogart and Abyss, with 2 albums apiece, none of which were hit widespread commercial success before Beck either quit or moved on. And he had a hit with Hi-Ho Silver Lining, which he later referred to as, he said he didn't like it, and it was like having a pink toilet seat around his neck, before he decided to go in a totally different direction, attracted to jazz rock by Billy Cobham's albums, and particularly by his friend John McLaughlin's Mahavishnu Orchestra, and their recent release at the time, Apocalypse. He hired the former Beatles producer George Martin, who'd just produced the Mahavishnu album, and wrote an album of entirely instrumental tracks with orchestral backing in what, despite lukewarm reviews in the Rolling Stone at the time, went on to be his best-selling album and the first in his own name. From Blow by Blow, here's Scatterbrain. Scatterbrain there from Jeff Beck's seminal album Blow by Blow, which went on to be the fourth best-selling album in the Billboard charts of the year and topped their jazz albums list. Max Middleton had plenty of airtime on the roads there, which is very popular again now. And of course, he did form another Jeff Beck group with Jan Hammer, which had some success afterwards. But in an interview in '99, Beck said, "Blow by Blow was an accident," he said. "I'd always fed off singers or guitar riffs before, but Max Middleton kept throwing these beautiful chords at me, and Stevie Wonder had come up with some beautiful melodies, so I had no choice but to follow them. It was like starting all over again, as if I'd never played the guitar before."
Often the way how some classic albums come about almost by accident, and that's very true of this next one. It's the Köln Concert. It's possibly, again, one of those albums, along with maybe Kind of Blue, or something that people who don't have or listen to jazz might have on their shelves somewhere or in their collections, whether it's a digital collection or whatever the case may be, or even vinyl perhaps these days, you know. But yes, it was a concert which had everything not going for it. The weather wasn't good. The piano was rubbish. It almost didn't happen. It went ahead and it became one of the best selling albums in the jazz genre of all time, I think. I think due to pretty much the genius, the improvisatory genius of Keith Jarrett. that still sounds good, I must admit. The first he did on the ECM label, Pat Metheny, Bright Size Life, with a young Pat Metheny. I think he's in his 70s now too. Jaco Pastorius, no longer with us, sadly died far too young, but he would have been young there. Fantastic on bass, the fretless bass. And Bob Moses, fantastically organic drummer, who I think is still going. Stand to be corrected there. I haven't heard him for a long time, but he was a wonderful drummer and educator. Unquity Road, I think that's how it's pronounced, in any case, from Bright Size Life. And before that, we had the rather prosaically named Part 2C from the Köln concert with Keith Jarrett, this classic concert from our year in question where everything was wrong. They had the wrong piano. They put in a piano which was substandard. It was raining. He was feeling really ill. He almost walked off and didn't do it and is persuaded to at the 11th hour because the recording equipment was there, and came up with a classic which is the biggest selling piano jazz album of all time.
Well, that's about it for this the year special. Please drop us a line if you guessed the year and with any thoughts about tonight's music or any music you'd like to hear on the show. Chris Kane with an E at manxradio.com or Howard Kane at manxradio.com.
Same E.
Before we finish up, shall we put you out of your misery? OK. All tonight's tracks are, can you believe it, half a century old, coming from 1975.
Lord, that makes you feel old.
I hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to drop us a line. Now, the last track is one I heard while on holiday in Edinburgh with the folks when I walked into a small record shop at the bottom of the Royal Mile called Bruce's Records. I asked to buy the record playing, and the owner said, you can, but you'll have to wait a while so I can hear the other side, and I only have the one copy. The album was Philip Catherine's Guitars. Born in London to an English mother and a Belgian father, Philip is still touring, aged 82, and I saw him at Dinant this year. May have an interview with him coming a bit later. He studied at Berkeley with Mick Goodrick and George Russell, played in the Dutch group Focus, can you believe, when Jan Akkerman left, and toured and recorded with several greats, including Larry Coryell, Stefan Grappelli, Charles Mingus, Benny Goodman, Chet Baker, and so many more. With 131 recording sessions to his name and 40 albums of his own, he's well worth exploring. Guitars was him multi-tracking many stringed instruments and covered lots of styles, and after being absent in the Atlantic Records vault for 40 years, it was finally released as a box set in 2018. From it, here's Sneezing Bull. See you in a couple of weeks.
Be good.
Bye for now.